Hi, I just finished Wilmingtons Lie, the 1898 Coup and the Rise of White Supremacy by David Zucchino. So I thought I would come on here and give you my thoughts about that while it's still fresh in my mind. So this is the first book that I've read for the octafinals round in the BookTube Prize, and I have to say I'm already kind of like, what did I get myself into? Because I thought the book was good, but I think I don't like reading histories. I find history interesting to read about in, say, small doses or a magazine article or something like that, but this was a whole book about the 1898 coup in Wilmington, and while it was very informational, I did not really enjoy the reading experience. I found it a chore to get through. But I think if you are somebody who likes history, this would be a good book to read. Again, I listened to this as an audiobook, but I did look up some information about the print copy of it, and it seems very well researched, and it's, it kind of lays out the events chronologically and everything like that, but there were just so many people to keep track of, and in the actual print book, and I guess this would be the case for the Kindle edition too, the author, David Zucchino, does at the beginning give a list of all the principal actors who were involved in this, but yeah, it was super hard for me to keep track of who everybody was listening to this as an audiobook. And and then probably the parts that I liked the best was I really liked the epilogue, because Zucchino traces things that happened in the 1898 coup, the lead up to it, and then the sort of aftermath of it. He makes connections between that and historical and contemporary and current events, and I really wanted there to be more of that throughout the book, because often he would be talking about something and I would think to myself, this is like, I cannot believe how eerily similar this is to stuff that has happened in recent years. But that connection is not made for you right then. You have to and it's not even like he connects all the threads at the end. He just does a better job of actually addressing those things. And, again, I don't really read histories of stuff, and so maybe that's just not the convention, and that's not how histories are written. But I personally would have liked to have seen more connections made between stuff that he's talking about that happened leading up to the 1898 coup and the immediate aftermath. I would have liked to see more connections made throughout between that stuff and then contemporary stuff that we're seeing. So that was one thing. The fact that there were way too many characters to keep track of, or people rather to keep track of, was another thing. And again, if I had been reading this as an ebook or a print book, I would have constantly been flipping back to the beginning to see, who was that again? I did also like that this was about my home state of North Carolina, because this is not something that we learned about in history, even though we had North Carolina history. And one figure in particular who gets talked about in this book, Charles B. Aycock, was a former governor of North Carolina and apparently an ardent white supremacist. And no one saw fit to mention that when in elementary school they took us all on a field trip to Charles B. Aycock's childhood home, so we could learn about pioneer sort of days and stuff. So that was also quite interesting and illuminating. And I did like that. One of the things I think that really kept me interested in this book, even though, again, I found it largely a chore and a slog to get through, was the fact that I knew a lot of the references to places and towns and counties that got mentioned, like Edgecombe County, and even Rocky Mount, my hometown, got mentioned, and Tarboro, and New Bern and Raleigh and the News and Observer, which is the Raleigh newspaper, and you know, UNC Chapel Hill, etc., etc. So so that was all interesting. So yeah, I feel really conflicted about this book because on the one hand I feel like it is like a very good and well-researched history, but I didn't personally enjoy it. So I think it will be interesting to see where I end up ranking this one among the other books, especially considering whether or not I get on with the other books. So the next book I'm going to read is, again, I'm also going to listen to this as an audiobook, is Catherine Cho's memoir, Inferno. I think that's about her experience at having postpartum psychosis, maybe. And thankfully it's much shorter than Wilmingtons Lie. Wilmingtons Lie was like 11 and a half hours on audiobook, and this book is 6.5 hours, so I can get through it in, you know, a week or less, so I'm gonna be happy about that. So I will let you know what I think about the Catherine Cho when I finish that. Hi, so I've just finished listening to Catherine Cho's Inferno, a memoir of motherhood and madness. So I wanted to come on here and give some impressions of it. So I listened to this on audiobook, and it was narrated by the author Catherine Cho herself, which I think made it just that much more impactful because it was like her telling me personally about her experience with postpartum psychosis. And this was a very harrowing and compulsively, I would call it compulsively readable, except I was listening to it. So compulsively listenable? I don't know if that's a word, but boom, I just made it one. So yeah, but it was very harrowing, and I definitely felt compelled to keep listening and find out what had happened. So when we open, she is in a psych ward, and then from there we kind of go backwards in time, and we hear about you know, basically kind of like her life story condensed, right? Like we hear about her growing up, we hear about a significant relationship that did not work out for some important reasons that she had before she met her husband. We hear about her meeting him and them getting married, and then we hear about kind of the trip and all of the events that led up to, well, we also hear about the birth of the son, right? And then we hear about the trip and the events that led up to the psychotic break that she experiences. And then interspersed with all of that are some, like, a lot of times there are reflections on family members and or Korean folk tales and mythology, because her family and her husband's family are both Korean. So that was all very interesting from a cultural standpoint. And then also interspersed with the sort of telling of her life story, and then, you know, finally you get around to the birth of her son, and like I said, the events leading up to her psychotic break and everything. So we also get interspersed with that scenes of her in the psych ward interacting with other people and other patients, and kind of trying to figure out what exactly is going on and how she can get out of here, right? So yeah, I really liked it overall. I think it's decidedly less harrowing once you find out how long she was in the hospital and the psych ward. I'm not going to reveal that, but I will say that objectively speaking, it's not a very long time. But I still, you know, I understand that, you know, any amount of time that you spend involuntarily committed to a psych ward or experiencing some sort of psychotic break, right, would be absolutely scary and harrowing. And, you know, obviously when she realized, you know, when she kind of like came back to reality and realized she was in a psych ward, and that she had been restrained, like physically restrained, that, you know, you would have no way of knowing at that point, like how, you know, how long you were going to be there, or when you could leave or go home, or, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So, so yeah, I will say it is decidedly less harrowing once you find that out, but that doesn't happen until toward the end. The only other thing I maybe didn't like as much about this is she uses a ton of rhetorical questions in this book. And I kind of understand why, because, again, if you're sort of questioning your own perceptions of reality and what's real and what's not real, I understand why there would be a lot of questions, but they just got redundant after a while, and I just feel like no one actually asked that many rhetorical questions, and they're effective as a device used sparingly, but there were just too many of them. But yeah, otherwise, I thought this was super interesting. I thought it brought up a lot of interesting points about motherhood and the sort of loss of your own identity as a separate human once you become a mother, and how she felt even when she was still pregnant, right, that at that point her body was no longer her own because it belonged to her unborn child, and all of that stuff I found really fascinating. And yeah, it was good. I would recommend this to anybody, especially if you have an interest in memoir or have an interest in psychology or things of that sort. Yeah, again, super interesting, and I'm glad that I read this after I read Wilmingtons Lie, because I was pretty disheartened after I read Wilmingtons Lie that all of the books that I was going to read for the BookTube Prize this round were going to be boring and not fun. I mean, not that listening to somebody talk about their psychotic break was fun, but it was definitely more interesting. So anyway, so I think the next book up on my list that I'm waiting for is a print copy of Jessica Goudeau's After the Last Border, which is about refugees in the United States. So I'm waiting on a print copy of that, so that will be the next book that I talk about. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing how I get on with that one. So I will check in later. Hello, I finished Jessica Goudeau's After the Last Border, Two Families in the Story of Refuge in America, earlier today, so I thought I would come on here and share my thoughts before it gets too far removed from when I actually read the book. So I really loved this book. It tells the interweaving stories of two women. One is a refugee from Myanmar named Munao, and then the other, sorry, Charlene. The other one is a refugee from Syria named Hasna, and so their stories are sort of interspersed throughout the book, and then also included occasionally is a chapter that tells about kind of the history of refugee resettlement in the United States and how the policies on that have changed and evolved over time. But mainly it's the interweaving stories of Muna and Hasna. And yeah, it was really good. I found it super compelling. Literally, I was sort of sad to see the book end, and like for this to be nonfiction, what? So I felt like the author did an excellent job in making me feel very invested in these two women and their stories. And I typically would read this book when I had my coffee in the morning, and so then, you know, every day I would pick it up and be like, oh, what's going to happen to Munal and Hasna today? So I felt very invested in them. And another thing I think was smart about this book is that we meet them at different points in their journey as refugees. So Munal we meet right when she gets to the United States, and I think around 2011, and we follow her and her family's journey over the next few years. And Hasna we meet in Syria, kind of at the start of all of the conflict that went on there. I think it started around 2011, so around the same time that Muna and her family originally came to the United States. And so mainly we follow Hasna and her family's time in Syria, and they're kind of back and forth between Syria and Jordan and trying to keep everyone in their family safe. And so we finally at the end, her family and Hasna and her family finally come to the United States, but we don't see too much of them in the United States. We mainly follow the events that eventually brought them to the United States, whereas Muna, we start with her in the United States and kind of see the whole progression of her time as a refugee and the impact that has on her emotionally, financially, etc., culturally, etc., etc. So I thought that was really good. I also thought another really smart aspect of this book is that it shows, even though these two women have similar experiences in terms of leaving their culture behind and coming to a place that's new, where they're not necessarily overtly welcomed by all sectors of society, and they struggle with the language, and they struggle with having jobs for the first time, and not having like a community of support around them, and the alienation and separation from parts of their families and all of that. Like in all of those respects, their stories are similar, but really where they differ is in the fact that Muna is a refugee from Myanmar who is part of the Karen people, and she is Christian. And Hasna's family is from Syria, and they are Muslim. So you can probably imagine where this is going, especially considering that Hasna finally makes it to the United States just a few months before Donald Trump is elected president. So anyway, this was really good. I had never really thought too much about refugee resettlement or the policies surrounding it or how it worked or anything like that. So it was very instructive as far as giving you a broad overview of how the policies have changed and evolved over time. Now, obviously, as someone who is Jewish, I did know about the St. Louis ship with Jewish refugees from Europe being turned away from the United States in the early 1940s, and then most of those people ending up perishing in death camps as a result. So I knew about that, but I didn't really know about, again, how the policies had specifically changed or evolved over time. So that was very interesting. And again, I think this book does a really good job at making an emotional connection with the reader, because again, I felt super invested in Hasna and Muna's stories, and I'm kind of sad that I finished the book. So yeah, this has definitely been my favorite of the BookTube Prize books that I've read so far. So I think it will be very hard for anything else to top this. Next, I am planning to start, because as I'm filming this, it's basically the end of February. I'm planning to start next Les Payne's The Dead Are Rising, which is a biography of Malcolm X, and is the longest book that I have to read for the BookTube Prize. So that is the book I will talk about next, and I will check in when I have thoughts. Hi, so I finished Les Payne's The Dead Are Rising earlier today, which is the biography of Malcolm X. Like David Zucchino's Wilmingtons Lie, I feel a little conflicted about this one, because I think if you have a pre-existing interest in Malcolm X, it's very informative as a biography, and I thought it was quite well researched. Les Payne and also his daughter, Tamara, have interviewed many different people in compiling this biography, so you hear perspectives from a lot of different people who knew Malcolm X at various points in his life. And I mean, it definitely tells like a cohesive story, right? Like it starts at the beginning and then goes all the way up to his assassination and then slightly after. So So it felt very complete in that regard. I did not, however, find it particularly compelling reading. There were some sections of it that were more interesting to me than others. But again, I think that's because I didn't really know that much about Malcolm X anyway. Like, I knew very little about him going into this book. And then, two, I didn't really have a strong, like, pre-existing interest in him. And so, again, I think if you have an interest in Malcolm X and you want to know more about the details of his life, this would be a good book to read in that regard. But again, I personally did not find it super compelling reading, mainly because the portrait that emerged of him was of someone who I found to not be a particularly sympathetic individual until quite late in the text, right? Like, it really wasn't until his break with the Nation of Islam and his, conversion to Sunni Islam and his travels in and around Africa that I started finding him to be more sympathetic and someone whose views I could relate to more, if that makes sense, because up to that point I just found him quite violent and misogynistic. And again, if you're reading a whole book that's about one person, if you don't feel like, you like the person, that makes it difficult reading, if that makes sense. So again, I did not find sort of the portrait that emerged of Malcolm X particularly compelling until, basically several months to a year before his assassination. So that made it, I think, not as interesting to me as it would be if you were someone who was interested in the more, I guess, sort of like radical elements of his past. But again, they're like very tinged with misogyny. So yeah, not a totally flattering portrait, I must say. But yeah, so it was informative and it was good, but again, it was not like the best read for me because I didn't personally find it, like I couldn't connect to the central figure of Malcolm X until quite late in the book. So, but like I said, it did interest me at some points more than others, so I think it's still going to end up ranking higher than the David Zucchino Wilmingtons Lie volume. So next up, I have Kindred, Neanderthal, Life, Love, Death, and Art by Rebecca Wragg Sykes, and I'm just going to go ahead and say that I'm not particularly optimistic that this is going to be a very compelling read to me because I just have no interest in this whatsoever, but I'm going to try to keep an open mind and we will see. So I'll get back to you when I'm done with this. And we're back. So I finished yesterday this book, Kindred, Neanderthal, Life, Love, Death, and Art by Rebecca Wragg Sykes. And I had already predicted that this one was probably going to be a tough sell for me because I don't really care about Neanderthals. And in fact, it was a tough sell, and I think, barring the fact that I still have one book left to read, I'm pretty sure this one is going to be my least favorite of this round of the BookTube Prize. Because it's very clear that Rebecca Wragg Sykes thinks that Neanderthals are endlessly fascinating. However, she does not communicate to me as the reader why I should also think that Neanderthals are endlessly fascinating. So while I appreciate that she has a lot of enthusiasm for her subject matter and clearly a lot of knowledge of them, this is very information heavy. At no point did she answer what we refer to in first year composition as the so what question. So she did not tell me why this mattered or was important. And I have to say that of the books that I've read so far, even if the author didn't always do a great job of answering the so what question, it was at least clear to me why it mattered to some extent. But this one was really sort of baffling to me until close to the end. Sorry, camera fell over there. So in one of the last few chapters of this book, she does finally talk about how all human all humans except for, like, there's a very small percentage of people that this is not the case of, but all humans right now, for the most part, have 2 to 3% of their DNA in common with Neanderthals. And so studying Neanderthals might provide some kind of insight into dispositions for certain illnesses and things of that sort. But again, she doesn't say that until quite close to the end of this. So yeah, again, I just did not care about it. And again, while I appreciate that she clearly has a lot of enthusiasm for her subject, and knowledge of it, and that she's thought really hard about Neanderthals, like, you have to tell me why I should care about this. Like, I mean, and you know, this is maybe partially because I am a pragmatist both by nature, but also that is the theoretical lens that I use to view most things. But it's like, what practical difference does it make, you know, where Neanderthals lived, or what they ate, or who they intermingled with, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Like, what practical difference does that now make to us in the 21st century? So yeah, this book fails to answer that question for me, and so that is why it has been my least favorite of the BookTube Prize books so far. So I still have left to read Amy Stanley's Shogun in the Stranger City, A Japanese Woman in Her World, so I will report back one last time after I have finished this. Okay, so I finished this book, Amy Stanley's Stranger in the Shogun City, A Japanese Woman in Her World, and in a surprise upset, this actually ended up being my, not actually least favorite reading of the round, but it's the one I'm going to rank the lowest overall. And I totally thought after I finished reading Kindred, which was super boring, and didn't tell me why I should care about Neanderthals, I in no way thought that that book could be not topped, bottomed? I don't know, but anyway, I didn't expect this would end up being the book that I ranked the lowest in the round, but here's why. So this book neither told me why this mattered, nor did it know what it was about. And Kindred, for all of my frustrations with how boring it was and how much I did not care about Neanderthals, and how much Wragg Sykes did not tell me why I should care about Neanderthals, at least that book knew what it was about. This one doesn't. So, ostensibly, this book tells the story of a woman named Tsuneno who lived in early to mid 19th century Japan, and was an unconventional woman who was not a particularly obedient daughter, and ended up getting married and divorced 4 times, I think, in all. It kind of got hard to keep track after a while. And then eventually she ends up running off to Edo, which is now known as Tokyo, by herself to sort of start a new life. And so that's the ostensible premise of the book. And I'm gonna tell you what it says on the blurb. So it says, Tsuneno's life provides a window into 19th century Japanese culture and a rare view of an extraordinary woman who sacrificed her family and her reputation to make a new life for herself in defiance of social conventions. Now, I know that the author is not always responsible for writing the blurb and sometimes has no control over what the blurb says. However, if you ostensibly make your book center around this one woman, then she must have done something important or noteworthy, but she didn't. So the fact that the blurb calls her an extraordinary woman, again, to me implies that she's done something important or noteworthy that I should be paying attention to and we should all be talking about, but she didn't. So yes, she was an atypical woman. It was unusual that she was not particularly obedient or subservient, which were values for women in Japanese culture. So that was unusual, and yes, it was unusual that she got married and divorced 4 different times. So that was, like, again, atypical for a woman of the time period, but it's not like she did anything noteworthy. So again, why should I care about this woman? So Amy Stanley sort of fails to answer that question for me. And then the other problem I have with this book is that it doesn't know what it's about. Because again, ostensibly it's telling Tsuneno's story, but because Amy Stanley didn't really have a ton of information to go on, she had a lot of records and letters, but that was pretty much it. And so there are large parts of the book that then go off onto tangents about various aspects of Japanese culture and society at the time that Tsuneno was alive. And while those asides were interesting, again, they weren't totally related to this main story. And so I kind of get the impression that Amy Stanley really just wanted to write a book about, like, early to mid 19th century Japanese culture, but she was thinking to herself, gosh, I really need something to tie this all together. And then when she discovered this woman, she's like, aha, that's what I'm gonna do. And so then she you know, sort of forced an overlay on her existing, you know, history that she already had of this woman's life, which again would be fine if Tsuneno was important for us to know about or did anything significant or noteworthy, but she was just like a regular person. And, you know, again, if you're gonna just tell me the life of a regular person, you gotta tell me why I should care about this. Like, why does it matter? Like, yes, it's interesting that we're getting a window into, you know, early to mid 19th century Japanese culture, but why Tsuneno? Why her specifically? So yeah, and Amy Stanley fails to answer that question for me. So even though the actual reading experience of this book was not as tedious or dull as Rebecca Wragg Sykes' Kindred, because the book fails on both of those accounts for me, that it doesn't know what it's about and also it doesn't tell me why it matters, it ended up getting 6th place overall in the round for me. So just to do a recap, so in 6th place, Stranger in the Shogun City by Amy Stanley. In 5th place, Kindred, Neanderthal Life, Love, Death, and Art by Rebecca Wragg Sykes. In 4th place, David Zucchino's Wilmingtons Lie, which was the first book I read for this round. And yeah, it was very informative, but it was super boring and a slog to get through. Number 3, Les and Tamara Payne's The Dead Are Arising, which is the biography of Malcolm X. That was the number 3 book for me. I didn't love it, and I didn't love the reading experience of it, but I did think it was more interesting at times and more engaging than David Zucchino's Wilmingtons Lie. Number 2 in this round for me was Catherine Cho's Inferno, which is a memoir about her experience with postpartum psychosis, which I found very engaging and interesting reading. And then my number 1 read of this round was Jessica Goudeau's After the Last Border, which is the 2 interweaving stories of 2 women from different countries who end up becoming refugees and coming to the United States, and also the history and evolution of refugee resettlement in the United States over time. So yes. So, oh, and in case people care about my star rating, so the Jessica Goudeau book got 4.5 stars, Catherine Cho, 4 stars, The Dead Are Arising, 3.5 stars, Wilmingtons Lie, 3 stars, Kindred, 2.5 stars, and Stranger in the Shogun City, 2 stars. So this was actually very easy for me to judge because literally all of the books had different star ratings, and I didn't have to sort of, you know, quibble with, well, I gave 2 of them 3 stars, so which one's going to go here and which one's going to go here. So those are my rankings overall. If you have made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. If you had this round of books in the BookTube Prize judging, I would love to know what your rankings and thoughts about them were. So yeah, if you have thoughts about anything, please let me know that down in the comments below. Hope everyone is staying healthy and well. I hope you're doing good reading whatever you're reading. And until next time, would it kill you to call you mother?